There was a man who ruled the most powerful empire on earth, commanded legions that could erase entire nations, and yet every single night, he sat alone with a candle and a blank page and wrote himself a brutal, unforgiving letter about how badly he had failed that day. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and what you're about to hear is not a history lesson. It's a weapon, because somewhere in a cold tent on the frontier of a crumbling empire, a sick, exhausted emperor discovered a truth so dangerous that if you actually apply it, it will quietly dismantle every excuse you've ever used to explain why you're not where you want to be. And that truth is this: you are not weak because life is hard. You are weak because you have never been taught how to think. And for the next few minutes, you are going to be taught, because Stoicism was never a philosophy for monks in quiet gardens. It was forged by men who buried their children, lost their fortunes, watched their cities burn, and were exiled to islands with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And instead of breaking, they built an internal fortress so strong that Roman senators, emperors, and generals used it to stay sane, while holding the fate of the known world in their hands. And here is the first brutal truth they discovered. The one modern self help gurus water down into a fortune cookie, because they're too afraid to say it properly. Nothing outside of you has any power over you unless you hand it that power yourself. Not your boss, not your ex, not your bank account, not the traffic, not the news, not the comment section, nothing. Because Epictetus, the man who taught Marcus Aurelius everything he knew about self-command, was born a slave, literally owned by another human being, beaten so severely by his master that his leg was permanently crippled, and from that position of total physical powerlessness, he built a philosophy so ironclad that it eventually reached the ears of an actual Roman emperor, who studied it like scripture, because Epictetus figured out something almost nobody today understands. There are only two categories of things in your entire existence: the things you control and the things you don't. And almost every ounce of your suffering, your anxiety, your rage, your bitterness comes from spending your energy on the second category while completely neglecting the first. You don't control what people think of you. You don't control the economy. You don't control whether it rains on the day of your big event. You don't even fully control whether you get sick or when you die, but you absolutely, completely, 100% control how you respond to every single one of those things. And the moment you truly absorb that distinction, something shifts in you permanently, because you stop begging the world to be fair and you start becoming the kind of person unfair worlds cannot break. And this is exactly what separates a self-made mind from a mind that waits to be made by circumstances, because the self-made man doesn't wait for permission from the universe to become powerful. He treats every obstacle as raw material, which brings us to the second discovery, the one that turned a marketplace of Roman traders into an army of unshakable thinkers. The obstacle is not in the way. The obstacle is the way, meaning that the very thing you're dreading right now, the thing you're avoiding, the rejection you fear, the failure you're terrified of, is not blocking your path to strength. It literally is the path, because muscle doesn't grow in comfort, it grows in resistance. And Marcus Aurelius, sitting in that freezing military tent, dying slowly from a plague that would eventually kill him, wrote something so simple, it's almost embarrassing that no one told you this sooner. He said that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. And think about what that actually means for your life right now. That job that rejected you, that person who betrayed you, that failure that humiliated you in front of everyone. None of that was the universe punishing you. It was the universe handing you free weights, and most people put the weights down and walk away complaining about how heavy life is. But the self-made mind, the disciplined king in training, picks the weight up and says thank you, because he understands something the crowd never will. Comfort is the graveyard of potential, and discipline is not punishment. Discipline is the highest form of self-respect there is, because when you master your own reactions, when you stop being a puppet yanked around by every insult, every setback, every bad mood of the day, you become something rare in this world. A person who cannot be controlled. And that is precisely why the Stoics were so terrifying to tyrants throughout history, because you cannot threaten a man who has already made peace with losing everything. You cannot bribe a man who has already decided that external things are not where his worth lies. You cannot humiliate a man who has already stripped away his need for approval. And this is the mind we are building across this series, brick by brick, using the exact tools that turn slaves into philosophers and emperors into legends. And if what you've heard so far has cracked something open in you even slightly, understand that this was only the foundation, because in the next part, we go deeper into the private journal of an emperor who ruled the world and still felt like a failure most nights, and what he wrote to fix that feeling will change how you see your own mind forever. Picture the most powerful man alive, ruler of an empire stretching across 3 continents, a man whose single word could send 100,000 soldiers marching to their deaths, sitting alone in a war tent at night, and instead of writing about conquest or glory, he's writing to himself like a disappointed father scolding a child, telling himself to stop being so easily irritated by fools, telling himself that he woke up too late again, telling himself that he's allowed himself to be dragged into arguments beneath his dignity. This is the actual private diary of Marcus Aurelius, later called Meditations. And here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. He never intended for anyone to read it. This wasn't a book written for fame or legacy. It was raw, unfiltered, brutal self-correction from a man who, despite ruling the known world, still woke up every single day and had to fight his own mind just like you do. And that single fact should demolish one of the biggest lies you've been telling yourself. The lie that says, successful people don't struggle like I do. Because the most powerful human being on the planet, at that moment in history, was privately terrified, privately frustrated, privately exhausted, and the only difference between him and someone who crumbles under that same weight is that he had a system, a discipline, a ritual of confronting his own weakness on paper every single night, without mercy and without excuse. And this is the second pillar of the self-made mind: radical, unflinching self-audit. Because the moment you stop lying to yourself about your own behavior, you gain a kind of power that most people never touch in their entire lives. And Marcus Aurelius understood something almost nobody in the self-improvement industry today has the courage to say, which is that self-improvement isn't about feeling good, it's about becoming accurate. It's about looking at your own laziness, your own cowardice, your own pettiness with the same cold clarity a surgeon looks at a wound. No flinching, no softening the diagnosis, because you cannot fix what you refuse to see clearly. And this is exactly why he opens his own journal reminding himself, essentially, today I will meet people who are ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and unsociable. Not as a complaint, but as mental preparation. Because here is a truth that will save you years of unnecessary suffering. The Stoics didn't waste energy hoping the world would be kind to them. They assumed friction, they assumed betrayal, they assumed disappointment, and by expecting it in advance, It lost its power to destroy their peace when it arrived. This is called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. And it sounds bleak until you realize it's actually the opposite of pessimism. It's psychological armor, because the untrained mind gets blindsided by every insult, every failure, every unexpected betrayal, and spirals into anger or self-pity, while the trained mind already rehearsed the blow mentally and simply absorbs it and moves forward, like a soldier who has already imagined the battlefield before stepping onto it. And this brings us to a truth that Marcus Aurelius returns to again and again in his private writing, one that modern culture has almost completely inverted. Your reputation is not your responsibility. Your character is, because he writes about how quickly fame fades, how the men praised as heroes in one generation are utterly forgotten a few decades later, how the applause of the crowd is fickle and cheap, and ultimately meaningless. And yet look at how most people today are living. Entire lives built around chasing likes, followers, approval, validation from strangers who will forget them within seconds of scrolling past. While the Emperor of Rome, a man who could have any luxury imaginable, was writing to himself that the only thing that actually matters is whether you acted with justice, self-control, courage, and wisdom in that specific moment, not whether anyone noticed, not whether anyone applauded, not whether it made you look good. And this is where the self-made mind truly separates itself from the crowd, because the self-made man is not performing virtue for an audience. He's building it in private. In the same way, Marcus Aurelius built his in a candlelit tent, where no one was watching, and no one would ever know if he cheated on his own standards. And that's the real test, isn't it? Who are you when no one is grading you? When no one will ever find out? When there's no applause waiting on the other side? Because that version of you, the one that exists in total privacy, is your actual character. Everything else is just a costume, and this leads to perhaps the most quietly devastating idea in the entire philosophy, one that Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself likely while suffering from the very illness that would eventually kill him. You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think, not as a morbid threat, but as clarifying fuel. Because when you actually sit with the fact that your time is not guaranteed, that this exact day could be your last, the petty arguments dissolve, the need for others' approval dissolves, the procrastination dissolves, and what's left is a strange, sharp clarity about what actually matters. And this is not fear of death. This is the opposite. This is freedom through the acceptance of death. Because a man who has made peace with the fact that he could die today no longer wastes his remaining days performing for an audience or drowning in anxiety about tomorrow. He simply acts with discipline, with intention, with total presence. And if you've felt even a flicker of that clarity while listening to this, understand that we've only uncovered the private mind of the emperor, because in the next part, we step outside the palace walls entirely into the life of a man who lost every single possession he owned in a single afternoon and used that exact catastrophe to become the most formidable philosopher of his era. Somewhere around 300 years before Marcus Aurelius was even born, a wealthy Phoenician merchant named Zeno loaded his ships with an entire fortune's worth of expensive purple dye, the kind of cargo that could set a man up for life, and set sail across the Mediterranean toward Athens. And then, without warning, his ship wrecked. Every single thing he owned sank to the bottom of the sea, and Zeno washed ashore in a foreign city with absolutely nothing, no money, no cargo, no home, no plan, just a man standing on a beach who used to be rich and was now, by every practical measure, a nobody. And here is where most people's story would end, drowning in grief over what was lost. But Zeno did something almost unthinkable. He later said that his shipwreck was the best thing that ever happened to him, not because losing everything feels good, but because it forced him, penniless and humiliated, to wander into a bookstore in Athens, where he stumbled onto the teachings of Socrates. And something about that philosophy hit him so hard that he abandoned the entire life of a merchant and spent the rest of his years studying under the philosophers of Athens, eventually starting his own school of thought in a public colonnade called the Painted Porch, known in Greek as the Stoa. And that is where the word Stoicism actually comes from, not from some ivory tower of privilege, but from a bankrupt shipwreck survivor teaching in a public walkway, because he couldn't even afford an indoor classroom. And I want you to actually sit with that origin story for a moment, because it tells you everything about what this philosophy really is. It isn't a doctrine invented by comfortable men, theorizing about hardship from a safe distance. It is a survival manual literally forged by catastrophe, built by a man who had every reason to become bitter, and instead chose to become brilliant. And this is the third pillar of the self-made mind, the one most people flinch away from because it demands something modern culture actively discourages: the total, unemotional acceptance that loss is not the end of your story. It's frequently the beginning of your actual story. Because Zeno's entire fortune had to disappear before his mind had the space to build something that would outlast every coin he ever owned. Something that would influence emperors, generals, slaves, and everyday people for the next 2,000 years. And think about how differently we're conditioned to react to loss today. We treat financial failure, heartbreak, public embarrassment, or a ruined plan as evidence that we are broken, as proof that we should give up, when the actual pattern across history, again and again, shows that the moment everything falls apart is frequently the exact moment true character gets forged. Because comfort never demanded anything from Zeno, it was the wreck that demanded transformation. And the Stoics who came after him built an entire philosophical framework around this exact idea. They called it amor fati, a love of fate, meaning you don't just tolerate what happens to you. You don't just grit your teeth and endure it. You actively welcome it as necessary material for the person you're becoming. And this sounds insane until you realize this is precisely what separates people who get destroyed by hardship from people who get forged by it. Because two men can lose their job on the exact same day, one spirals into months of self-pity and blame, replaying the injustice over and over, poisoning every relationship around him with his bitterness, while the other treats it as Zeno treated his shipwreck, as an unexpected doorway into a life he never would have chosen for himself. But that turns out to be exactly what he needed. And the difference between those two men isn't luck, it isn't privilege, it isn't circumstance. It's a decision, a trained mental posture that says loss is data, not verdict. And here is something almost no one tells you about the Stoics, something that shatters the common myth that Stoicism means suppressing emotion and walking around like an emotionless statue. That's not what any of this actually taught. Zeno never said, "Don't feel the pain of losing everything." He felt it completely. What he refused to do was let that pain dictate his next move indefinitely. He processed it, and then he acted. Because Stoicism was never about the absence of feeling. It was about refusing to let feeling become the dictator of your decisions. There's a massive difference between grieving a loss for an appropriate season and building an entire identity around being a victim of that loss for the rest of your life. And this is exactly why the philosophy that grew out of a shipwreck eventually reached the desk of the most powerful man in the Roman Empire. Because it isn't a philosophy for the comfortable. It's a battlefield manual for anyone who has ever had the ground pulled out from under them. And if you've ever lost a job, a relationship, a version of your future you were certain of, and felt like that loss defined you, understand that it's simply the wreckage on the beach, and what you build from that wreckage is entirely still up to you. And this is the point where the philosophy stops being an ancient history lesson and becomes something you have to actually practice. Because knowing that the obstacle is the way, knowing that your reactions are the only thing you truly control, knowing that loss is often the beginning rather than the end, none of it means anything until you build the daily discipline to actually live it. And that is exactly where we're headed in the final part of this series, where we take everything Marcus Aurelius wrote in private, everything Epictetus taught from captivity, and everything Zeno built from a shipwreck, and turn it into an actual system you can use starting tomorrow morning. Because a philosophy you admire but never practice is nothing more than entertainment. And what you're about to learn next is not entertainment. Here is the uncomfortable truth that separates everyone who has ever watched a motivational video and felt inspired for exactly 20 minutes before returning to the exact same life. From the rare few who actually transform inspiration without a system is just entertainment. And everything Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Zeno taught only became powerful because they turned it into daily, repeated, almost boringly consistent practice. Not because they had a single lightning bolt moment of enlightenment. So if you actually want the discipline of kings, instead of just admiring it from a distance, here is the actual working system, stripped of mysticism, that you can start using tomorrow morning before your feet even hit the floor. And it begins with something Marcus Aurelius did every single day of his adult life, which is that he woke up before dawn and immediately reminded himself in writing that today he would encounter difficult people, unfair situations, and frustrating obstacles, and instead of that being depressing, he used it as a form of mental armor. So your first daily practice is this: before you check your phone, before you touch social media, before the world floods your mind with other people's opinions, you spend 60 seconds asking yourself one brutal question. What is likely to test my patience today? And how will I respond when it happens? Because the mind that has already rehearsed the ambush cannot be ambushed, and this single habit alone will eliminate the majority of the emotional whiplash that currently controls your entire day. And the second practice, borrowed directly from Epictetus, the crippled former slave who somehow built an unshakable inner fortress, is what modern psychologists now call the control audit, which means that anytime you feel anxiety, anger, or stress building in your chest, you stop and mentally sort the situation into exactly two columns. Column 1, things I control, which is only ever my effort, my attitude, my honesty, and my response, and column 2, everything else, which includes other people's opinions, the economy, traffic, the weather, and the outcome of things you've already done your best on. And the moment you consciously move your attention out of column 2 and back into column 1, the anxiety doesn't necessarily disappear instantly, but its grip on you weakens dramatically because you stop fighting a battle you were never equipped to win in the first place. And this leads directly into the third practice, the nightly discipline that Marcus Aurelius used inside a war tent while ruling an empire, which is the evening audit, meaning that before you sleep, you spend a few honest minutes reviewing your day with zero self-flattery and zero excessive self-punishment. You simply ask yourself 3 questions. What did I do well today? Where did I fail to meet my own standard? And what will I do differently tomorrow? And you write the answers down, because the simple act of writing forces a level of honesty that thinking alone never achieves. This was never meant to be a gentle self-esteem exercise. It was meant to be a mirror, cold and accurate. The same mirror a blacksmith uses to inspect a blade for weaknesses before it goes back into the fire. And the fourth practice, drawn directly from Zeno's shipwreck philosophy, is something you can call the loss rehearsal, and it sounds strange until you try it. Once a week, you deliberately imagine losing something you currently take for granted. Your health, your income, your relationships, your reputation. Not to manifest fear, but to strip away the numbness that makes us treat everything as permanent, because the moment you imagine actually losing what you have, gratitude returns instantly and entitlement disappears. And people who practice this consistently report that their day-to-day irritations, the traffic, the rude comment, the minor inconvenience, simply stop registering as catastrophes because they've already mentally rehearsed real catastrophe and recognize the difference. And the fifth and final practice, the one that ties every single piece of this philosophy together into one unified discipline, is what the Stoics called living according to virtue, which simply means that in every decision, no matter how small, you ask yourself one question before acting. Is this the courageous choice, the honest choice, the disciplined choice, or am I about to choose comfort, convenience, or cowardice? Because every single action you take is either building the fortress of your character or quietly eroding it. There is no neutral ground. The conversation you avoid because it's uncomfortable, the work you delay because you don't feel motivated, the boundary you fail to set because you're afraid of disappointing someone. Every one of those moments is a brick either added to or removed from the person you are becoming. And this is ultimately what the discipline of kings actually means. Not that you rule over armies or empires, but that you rule over yourself so completely that no external circumstance, no cruel comment, no financial collapse, no betrayal, no illness can dictate who you are on the inside. Because Marcus Aurelius ruled the most powerful empire on earth and still considered his greatest achievement to be mastery over his own reactions. Epictetus was a crippled slave who possessed more inner freedom than most free men who ever lived. And Zeno lost his entire fortune in a single afternoon and built something that would outlast every empire that came after him. And none of them were born with this strength. They built it through the exact 5 disciplines you just heard: morning preparation, the control audit, the evening review, the loss rehearsal, and the daily choice of virtue over comfort. And the only question left, the only thing standing between you and becoming the version of yourself these men would recognize as one of their own, is whether you close this out and forget everything you just heard within the hour, or whether tomorrow morning, before you touch your phone, you actually sit down and write the one honest sentence that starts it all today. I will not be ruled by anything I cannot control. So here you are, standing exactly where Zeno stood on that beach 2,000 years ago. Everything you thought you needed stripped away for a moment. Just you and the choice in front of you. Because every single thing we've walked through in this series, the emperor writing brutal letters to himself by candlelight, the crippled slave who built an unbreakable mind from nothing, the bankrupt merchant who turned a shipwreck into a legacy that outlived every empire that ever tried to conquer the world, all of it points to the exact same conclusion: that you were never actually waiting for better circumstances, more money, more time, more luck. You were only ever waiting for the decision to rule yourself. And that decision does not require permission from anyone. It does not require your past to be different. It does not require the world to finally be fair to you. It only requires you right now, today, to stop outsourcing your peace to people and situations that were never going to protect it for you. So if any part of this series has cracked something open in you, do not let it end here, as a nice video you watched and forgot. Write the sentence down. Say it out loud. Act on it in the next hour. Because a king is not made by the crown. A king is made by the discipline no one is watching. And that discipline starts the moment you decide it does. So decide it now.